Hello and welcome to a special edition of KGW Digital Q&A. My name is Galen Ettlin, and thank you so much for being here on our social media platforms. Today we are looking back at a mystery behind the story KGW has covered for a decade. Next week marks 10 years since the then 7-year-old Kyron Horman disappeared from his Portland elementary school, and the search is not over. There's a lot to get to in this story, and we are lucky today to be joined by KGW investigator Kyle Iboshi, who knows more about this case than most. We're going to be discussing what happened, the twists, the turns, developments all these years later, looking ahead. Kyle, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start with the background. Take us back to June 4th, 2010. I know I was about to graduate from high school in Portland, so I remember seeing Kyron's picture on the news. But for many people like me who may not have followed every single piece of this story unfold, what do you remember about that day?
Well, I think a lot of people, parents especially, were first alerted to this with a phone call they got from Portland Public Schools, which was actually an accident. It was supposed to go specifically to Skyline School parents. Instead, it went district wide. And so phones lit up with an announcement that a little boy, Kyron Horman, was missing. And if anybody had any information, to call police immediately. That alerted a lot of people, including my own wife, who called me and said, "Hey, what's going on with this little boy?" I called the station and sure enough found out that a little 7-year-old boy, a second grader at Skyline School, had disappeared. We'd soon learned his name was Kyron Horman. He'd gone to Skyline with his stepmother that day for a science fair. It was a busy day there at school. Classmates saw him, his teacher saw him, several other people saw him at the school as well. In fact, his stepmother snapped a photo of him in front of his science project. But really, that's the last anybody saw of Kyron Horman. And they weren't alerted to the fact that he was missing until later that day when his parents were waiting at the bus stop and he didn't get off the school bus. He was missing. So they called the
Can you
school and said, "Have you seen Kyron?" And they said, "Listen, he wasn't been at school all day today." And that triggered what would soon become the largest search in Oregon history for this little boy.
What can you tell us about that initial search? It sounds like a lot of people got the news pretty quickly, and that really sparked what we saw after that.
Yeah, it really was hands on deck immediately. So Multnomah County Sheriff's Office deployed their deputies. Portland Police was on scene and they searched. And if you're not familiar with that area, Skyline School sits in a rural part of Northwest Portland, surrounded by fields, rugged terrain, trees, a lot of places to be looking. That makes it very challenging. So immediately that night, within hours, crews were on the ground searching and doing everything they could to find this little boy. It was a long day. It was June, so a lot of daylight. They were out there searching with daylight until about 9 o'clock, and then it turned dark. But they continued to search all night long. And after that, they called for reinforcement. The military soon joined in with helicopters, and volunteers really from around the state joined in that search in that first week.
You just touched on it there, but what did police do in that first week or two to help in the search effort and then also try to find witnesses in the case?
Yeah. So not only was it Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, which does a lot of search and rescues, typically though for missing hikers, not for missing children in Portland, but the FBI was also involved, and they deployed some resources from around the country. They brought them in almost immediately, and a couple of techniques they used that they've used elsewhere. So one is they wanted to interview all the parents, all the students at Skyline School as quickly as they could. So within days, they had everybody come in and they asked them, "What do you remember seeing that day? Did you see this little boy? Anything you can tell us that was suspicious or unusual?" That was a starting point as far as the investigation goes. Additionally, later down the road, they would stop cars in front of Skyline School about the time he disappeared 1 week later and say, "Do you remember seeing anything as you drove along here?" Additionally, they just really asked for the community's help. That area, again, it's farmland, it's rugged. So a lot of people have outbuildings, have sheds. They encouraged everybody to go looking. They brought in dogs who searched the entire area, and they did a grid search. So really, that's what it sounds like. You go back and forth with hundreds of searchers looking for any trace of evidence. And what truly is incredible is during that entire search, they found nothing. Not a single thread of evidence, not a single piece of clothing, nothing that would suggest that Kyron Horman is there.
So, when did we hear from the family? Obviously, this is a huge ordeal for everyone involved, the community, and probably for them too. What was their message?
Yeah. And I think as a reporter, I kind of had an expectation we'd hear from the family immediately. In fact, I remember finding out who the father was and tried to reach him very early on, along with a lot of other reporters. Made contact with the family, and they said, just give us space, which I totally respect, and we did so. But at the same time, having covered enough missing persons cases, you know that sometimes families can play an important role in getting the message out, getting their kids' picture out there, and talking about why it's important they're returned or they're found. It helps generate interest in this case. And For the first few days, we didn't hear anything from the family. And for a lot of people, it was kind of troubling. Like, why aren't we hearing from the family? We heard from sheriff's office representatives on behalf of the family, but we didn't hear from mom, dad, stepmothers, stepfather, etc. We did finally, after engaging with them and kind of some back and forth emails, arrange for a press conference. And it was a week later, roughly, when the family actually spoke. And we heard from them and heard about the challenges, the struggles they were dealing with. And from that point forward, we continued to meet with them and had an opportunity to talk to them. But it really came about a week later that we actually heard from the family during.
So we heard from the parents, we heard from his stepmom, but what were the family dynamics going on there? Because they were all connected in sort of different ways.
Yeah, so the family dynamic is a bit challenging because it's a blended family. So Kyron Horman is this little boy who lived with his biological father, Kane Horman, and stepmother, Terry Horman. His biological mother, Desiree, lived in Medford along with her husband, Tony. And he would go between the two houses based on a custody arrangement. Um, During the press conference, though, they were all there, and we had an opportunity to see them. And they certainly appeared to be a united group that was struggling with this very challenging situation, very emotional. We'd later learned there was much more to that.
Can you talk a little bit more about what happened from there? Because we know Kyron's father, Kane, and stepmother, Terry Horman, separated. Then there was a restraining order. What happened there? Lots in the mix.
Yeah. So again, during that initial press conference, we really got the impression this is a united group. This is one family that's sticking together in all this. Behind the scenes, we find out that's really not the case in family. This is a family that's torn apart. On one side, you've got Terry Horman, the stepmother, by herself, and you've got the rest of the family. And there was suspicion around the stepmother very early on. And a lot of this comes from what we would later hear in divorce proceedings. So again, while they appeared to be a united group, a little later on, there was a divorce proceeding and there was a restraining order because the husband, Kane, alleged that really Terry wasn't being completely forthcoming. And he was told by law enforcement that there was a murder for hire plot against him, that allegedly Terry Horman, the stepmom, had asked the family landscaper to potentially kill Kane Horman. That drug this thing into court, and things really got nasty at that point as this divorce proceeding moved on, and a lot of allegations, including claims by Kane Horman that Terry had failed a couple lie detector tests, claimed that she later confirmed publicly. But a lot of questions about her whereabouts that day, the surroundings, and ultimately whether she had any involvement in it.
So there's lots of speculation around her, but have police ever named her as a suspect or person of interest here?
Now, so police have never officially named a suspect or a person of interest in this case. The closest thing to it, a judge in those divorce proceedings described her as a quote prime suspect, and that was in a court filing. So that's really the closest we've seen. Clearly, though, through law enforcement sources and through the family, they've had their eye on Terry Horman, the stepmother, from very, very early on in this investigation, and done a lot to try and pressure her to call her out. There was shortly after Kyron disappeared, a press conference held by the district attorney, and had a big sign built with her photo and a picture of their white truck, and said, "If you have any information that may be valuable, please call us." So that probably was about as close as they've come so far to pinpointing this on her, asking for additional information and having her picture there. But clearly, over the years, this has been the focal point of the investigation, and it did shift. So it started as a missing persons case, and then as the search wrapped up, they said, "Listen, this is a criminal investigation."
In a minute or so, we're going to get to a video that you helped compile of all of the background and kind of looking forward some of the developments along the way, a lot of the archive video that we've been able to dig up from KGW. But before we get to that, really, what has the community response been over the years as you've covered this story? What have you seen?
The response has been overwhelming from day one, and understandable, right? I mean, you've got this cute little kid who's missing in our community, and Skyline School was a tight knit school to begin with, so a lot of those folks were really tight and were struggling with the fact that this little boy was missing. But the broader community wanted to help. You know, everybody knew this little boy was out there somewhere, and so people volunteered not only in support of those search crews, taking them food. There were fundraisers, but just getting his picture out. I mean, there was during this time period. Keep in mind, you really couldn't go anywhere in Washington County, and for that matter, really the Tri-County area, without seeing a photo of him up in a storefront. There were huge billboards by the freeways with his picture. People were really sharing his photos and saying, "Listen, if you have any information about this boy, please call." And that was the hope, is that someone would spot him or someone would have information and call with in those initial days. And a lot of people did call. A lot of people responded with tips, but sadly, he's never been found.
Now that we have some of that background here, let's check out that clip that you helped put together. In just about 10 minutes, it really captures what you're talking about, that community response, the upheaval that this disappearance caused. So everyone watching, please take a look here, and then we'll see you in about 10 minutes to break it down and then look ahead at what else has happened since then.
Kyle came to school this morning. Kyron came to school this morning. He's 7 years old with his stepmom for the science fair. He was wearing this outfit.
Well, Steph, the Sheriff's Department launched a massive search within an hour of learning that Kyron was missing.
Investigators, the FBI is also on scene.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Kyron, we're gonna bring you home, buddy. Nothing is more important to your family, to your friends, to us. So.
Police are not releasing a lot of details except to say the case is now a criminal investigation.
I was fully expecting them to just slap the cuffs on her and take her away. They're going to do it any second. They're going to take her away. They're going to do it. Here we go. This is going to happen. And it doesn't work that way.
If you have seen Kyron or have any information you think may be beneficial, please call Portland Police.
Kyron was due home off the school bus at 3:45. He did not get off the bus.
And have they found any sign of him at all?
No, not that I've heard of any sign of him at this point.
7-year-old Kyron Horman was last seen after his stepmother, Terry Horman,
There's his picture.
drove him to school for one of the biggest days of the year, the school science fair.
The second grader at Skyline Elementary had worked hard on his project for the science fair.
This is a picture she took of the second grader with his project, the red-eyed tree frog.
After touring exhibits together, they say goodbye in the school hallway. She leaves for home. Kyron heads toward his classroom.
It's the last time anyone remembers seeing him.
Terry Horman posts photos of Kyron from the science fair on her Facebook page.
Kyron doesn't get off the school bus. His stepmom calls the school and learns the teacher had marked him absent.
This is devastating for the family, as you might guess, and for anybody that knows him. We just want to make sure he gets home safe.
By 9 o'clock, as we watch search teams wade through high grassy fields, Kyron had been missing more than 13 hours.
Police declared the area a major crime scene. By morning, the military and crews on the ground joined the search.
He's not the kind of child that would just go out of school and just go, searching or wandering around. He's just a very timid, sweet boy.
Okay.
Hey, are you guys ready?
All right, let me know. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jason Gates. I'm a captain with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, and I'm the incident commander.
In addition to the teams in the sky and on the ground, we're told about 50 detectives are also working the case.
The focus, the area around the school.
We're moving forward under the premise that we're looking for a living Kyron Horman.
On this rainy Sunday, police interviewed parents and children at Skyline School.
They're just trying to talk the kids through and just see if they can pick up any grains of information that they can to help, just to help.
The search turned into a massive community effort. From homemade signs to food donations, those who couldn't search did what they could to help.
Then on Friday, 1 week after Kyron's disappearance, his family speaks publicly for the first time.
Kyron, we miss you, we love you, and we need you home right now.
Search crews made their strongest push yet, with hundreds of volunteers from around the state joining the search for Kyron Horman.
We need a clue, we need that aha. This is the kind of terrain searchers are having to comb through: tall grasses, dense vegetation, and steep slopes. It makes for a slow and tedious process.
The pressure to turn up something intense, as so far each day has ended with little to report.
It's always frustrating, when we're not finding anything, especially when we have such high hopes.
Investigators suspended the search and rescue. It's become clear Kyron is not simply lost.
Would he just go on a hike at the end of the year? That doesn't seem like something he would do.
Detectives announced this has become a criminal investigation. And the focus?
Where is she and why is she not speaking?
We wanted to speak out as the natural parents for Kyron.
Behind the scenes, we'd later learn suspicions were mounting. His family had come apart.
Terry was on a whole nother playing field than we were. It was 3 against 1, and she was not looking out for Kyron. She was not interested in helping in any way.
Weeks after Kyron disappeared, police are handing out a questionnaire to parents and students at Skyline School,
asking people if they'd seen the stepmom or the family's white truck in the area the day the boy disappeared.
Investigators say they've talked with the majority of parents and staffers, but there's still people they want to interview.
Then,
hello, I'm Tracy Barrett.
And I'm Joe Donlin.
The unexpected.
The Kyron Horman investigation takes another turn. Now a reliable source tells News Channel 8 officers were prepared to arrest stepmom Terry Horman for hiring a hitman to kill her husband.
Kyron Horman filed for divorce, sought a restraining order against Terry Horman, and accused her of trying to hire a hitman to murder him.
And it was based on a lot of information that was provided, so it wasn't a sudden, say, reactionary type of decision that was made.
At that same news conference, Kyron's dad revealed another behind-the-scenes bombshell about Terry.
I think everyone knows the fact that she's taken her 2 polygraphs. She has not passed those 2 polygraphs.
Terry Horman hired a defense lawyer and moved to her parents' home in Roseburg.
Now again, Terry Horman has not been named a person of interest or a suspect in this case.
Terry Horman has never spoken to the media, but in court documents calls Kane's allegations vicious and calculated to inflame and poison public opinion against her.
Court papers from the divorce revealed Terry Horman had been sexting with another man after Kyron disappeared.
She's got some guts. I'll give her that. Now's not a good time to be doing stuff like that, but I guess I don't expect anything less.
Edie, are you cooperating with investigators? By late summer, a grand jury started hearing sworn testimony from Terry Horman's friends. No charges were filed.
Is she bound to testify, or could she say no?
She was subpoenaed. I look at people's actions, and the actions I see don't reinforce the fact that they're completely innocent. And whether it's related to Kyron or not, something's being hidden.
2 years after the boy's disappearance, Kyron's biological mother filed a civil lawsuit against Terry Horman, later dropped.
The time has come for Terry to take responsibility for what she has done and to tell me and my family where Kyron is and how he got there.
Terry Horman tried to change her name and appeared on the witness stand before a judge denied the request.
Kyron Horman is missing. He needs to be found. I love my son. I want him home more than anything.
Terry, what's your reaction to the judge denying this name change?
Hi, Kyle. No, thank you.
Horman, who now lives in California, has maintained her innocence, appearing on national TV and magazines.
She talks about Kyron's disappearance and also what she calls a bogus murder-for-hire plot to kill her husband.
I don't believe she'll ever be truly honest about what happened. I think even when we find Kyron, she will not reveal what happened that day.
But the search for him is still going strong.
Today, another under-the-radar search today for Kyron Horman. Police searched the woods, the water, and multiple properties over the years, but haven't found anything.
For comment, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office said, quote, "The investigation is continuing," end quote.
They've also released age-progressed photos of what Kyron would look like now as a teenager.
Kyron is a sweet little boy that just wanted to live his life and to go camping and fishing and be a kid, and he got that taken from him.
We are back live now discussing the disappearance of Kyron Horman 10 years later. Kyle Iboshi is with us. He helped put together that piece. Kyle, just out of curiosity here, putting all of that together 10 years later and really looking back at all of the coverage that you've helped be a part of, what was that like for you? What stood out?
Well, we had a lot of videotape. I mean, that was part of it is we'd gone back and looked at hundreds of hours of video because as this thing was unfolding, we saved all of those tapes. And to kind of relive it, it reminds me a little bit about how intense those initial first few days were. We had law enforcement from around the state coming in to help search. There were volunteers, media, and then how quickly we all embraced this little boy. You heard the story, and it was faint, but the public information officer, the spokesperson for the sheriff's office, misstated his name, which I don't blame her because I was in the same boat. I didn't remember his name initially, and I remember posting his picture and his name on our live truck when I was doing live reports so that I remember it's Kyron because for some reason that name didn't stick with me. Fast forward 10 years later, it's a name that will never escape me. I will forever remember the name Kyron Horman, and I think the greater community remembers that name as well. So it certainly has had a deep impact, I think, on many people in the community to this day.
Out of curiosity, have you spoken with Terry Horman? It seems like she knew you after all of those years of coverage. There was that little soundbite there where she greeted you by name. What has that discussion been like with her, if any?
So over the years, I mean, I've tried to reach out to Terry Horman countless times, not only through her lawyer, but her directly and also family members of hers. And she's never been willing to sit down and speak with me. She has taken the opportunity to speak with some national news outlets, including People Magazine, and she went on Dr. Phil not too long ago to kind of explain. And he asked her specific questions about that day and about the lie detector test and many other things. But as far as an opportunity to speak with her directly, I've tried repeatedly, and unfortunately, she's never been willing to share her side of the story.
Now, we do have a viewer question here. Someone saying, having been a second grade teacher, I have always wondered why we have never heard from Kyron's teacher that day. If his science project was there, wouldn't she wonder too where he was that day?
Mm-hmm. So another person I've reached out to is his teacher and haven't heard back. We did hear from a couple of representatives from the school very early on in the investigation. And I completely understand. It was a traumatic situation for them. They feel a deep connection to these students. And when one of your own goes missing, you feel some level of personal responsibility. And you see that on their faces and hear it in their voices. So we haven't heard directly from her. We've reached out over the years to various people in hopes of speaking with them, but unfortunately have not been able to.
Turning back to the family here 10 years later, what does Kyron's father, Kane Horman, have to say about this case?
Yeah. I spoke with Kane last week for quite some time. In fact, our raw interview is available on KGW.com. He mentioned a couple of things that were interesting to me. First and foremost, the question that I had to ask, that I've asked him repeatedly over the years, but wanted to see if really it's changed over time, is what do you think happened to Kyron? And he is still very hopeful that Kyron is out there. He thinks he's no longer maybe in the area, but he's with somebody, and ultimately he will be found. He remains optimistic and hopeful. He also mentioned that Kyron is present with him in every day. Pictures of Kyron hang in his home that he shares with his daughter, who was an infant at the time that Kyron disappeared. And now she's actually a student at Skyline School. I talked about their discussions and what that's like, kind of explaining that, listen, your brother is missing and has never been found. And he says he tries to be very straightforward and answer her questions as best as he can. Obviously, her questions become a little more detailed as she becomes older now, I think around 11 years old. So that's a challenge. But as he pointed out, every day he thinks about this little boy and hopes that he'll be back.
We've got another viewer question here, and I don't know as much background about this case, so you can clarify if there's something to this question. They ask, how come a bigger search was not made at Sauvie Island after her phone pinged there?
Right. So let me give you a little background on the story as far as the cell phone pinging. Law enforcement sources had suggested that part of the reason they were focused on searching Sauvie Island is because Terry Horman's cell phone had pinged, suggesting she was in that general area. So there was a lot of focus on Sauvie Island, Highway 30, that area. It's basically, I guess it would be east of the school. There was an intense search effort we saw it, and we've seen it over the years. They've searched waterways, they've taken dive teams in, they've used sonar, they've taken dogs in. They've searched that area extensively, private property, public property. So they have done a thorough search of those areas along Sauvie Island, as well as other areas where they've been focused. But I think they've done as best they can. Keep in mind, for anybody who's driven out there or seen the lay of the land, it's rough. There are huge, wide open spaces. There's high grass, bushes, there's trees. So it's not as simple as looking over a parking lot and having a clear view all around and, oh, there's nothing here. I mean, you literally could be walking within a couple feet of something and miss it. And that's the challenge.
It's really difficult to comb through, yes. Now, you also spoke with Kyron's biological mother, Desiree Young. How's she holding up now?
You know, she's very emotional. Every time I speak with her, I'm struck by, the impact this has had on her life. She to this day, when you ask about Kyron, you can sense her hope that he's out there, her hope that he's found. But at the same time, she's very honest about it and says, listen, the passage of time, as details have emerged about potential things that may have happened to him related to Terry Horman, she says, the chances of him coming home, there's a possibility he may not come home. And so she's quite frank about it. But at the same time, never gives up hope. And so, I can't imagine the challenges that she faces in dealing with the situation, being unresolved after all these years and just wanting to know what happened to him. And she asked the community and she asked Terry Horman specifically, end this for us. Give us the information we need to have some resolution to this case. She has a couple places in her home, specifically in her backyard. That's kind of an area she allowed us to visit last year. It has an area dedicated to Kyron where she sits and can think about him. And she has also kind of a special little area with a book that he used to enjoy reading. So he's certainly not forgotten for either Desiree or Kane. He plays an important role in their lives, and certainly they remain hopeful.
Now, as we approach the 10th anniversary since Kyron disappeared next week, there's also a new book released this week that focuses on this case. What does that book say?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to read an advanced copy of the book, and it really was interesting. I also spoke with the author at length, and again, we've posted that raw interview on KGW.com. The book is based on conversations with Desiree Young. She spent about 3 years speaking extensively with Kyron's mother, Desiree, to get a better understanding of how this story played out from really day one. And she also talked with a number of others, including Desiree's husband, Tony, and other family members. Kane Horman, the father, was not involved in the book. Law enforcement was not involved in the book. But it provides some strong circumstantial evidence, allegedly. Law enforcement won't confirm this information, but strong circumstantial evidence suggesting that Terry Horman may be involved. A couple points that I noted that were really interesting to me is that she claims that several witnesses saw Kyron leave Skyline School that day, the day he disappeared, with Terry and their infant daughter. Among those witnesses, a friend of Kyron, the friend's family, and also Kyron's regular school bus driver. Again, law enforcement hasn't confirmed this, but it's always been a little bit muddy as far as who saw Kyron leave and did anyone see Kyron leave. Law enforcement has not been completely clear about what evidence or what information they've been given by witnesses. So to me, that was really interesting. Additionally, the book talked about how quickly they focused in on Terry Horman, including wiring Kane. So detectives outfitted him with a wire in hopes of surreptitiously recording some conversations in the household, because during those early days, all the family was there. And so the suggestion was that maybe Kane would be able to obtain some type of information through a wire. And Terry noticed that, apparently. Again, this is all according to the book. And also some of her behaviors as far as her whereabouts. And this has been reported previously, but the book just reemphasized the fact that there were questions, there were holes in her story, her whereabouts that day, because we have a pretty specific timeline provided by law enforcement and also family sources. And within that timeline, there's a period of several hours where we don't have an exact understanding of where she was that day. And I think it's worth noting, too, in talking with Desiree several times about this, she says, listen, on that day, I remember everything about that. I remember what I had for lunch that day. Whereas she claims Terry has windows of time. She says, I don't really remember. And so to her, that's suspicious. The book also touches on some of the suspicious activity and behaviors by Terry in those first few days, including washing Kyron's backpack and his clothing the day he disappeared. So really raises a number of questions. But again, law enforcement so far has not been willing to confirm that information. We haven't heard from Terry Horman to get her version of the events. So while it's in the book, it's information provided by Desiree and the author, but no official confirmation from the investigator.
Before we get to some more viewer questions here and kind of looking at how this case has changed the community landscape in the big picture, I want to bring in our Jared Cowley, senior digital producer for KGW. There are so many layers to this, a very extensive coverage over the years by KGW. And Jared, you and the web team have put together a place for people to really explore it all. What does that look like?
Thanks, Galen. And thank you, Kyle, for coming on today to talk about this case. It's really heartbreaking to hear the whole history of it and how it's unfolded over the past 10 years. And you just hope for the best possible resolution, whatever it might be someday. We do have a lot of coverage of the Kyron Horman case on KGW.com, on the KGW News app. We have a Kyron Horman webpage at KGW.com/Kyron. And we have a lot of videos about the Kyron Horman case on our KGW YouTube channel. On KGW.com, you'll find an article about today's digital Q&A, the show you're watching right now. And that article, and you see it right there on the front page of our website, contains links to all of our Kyron Horman content. Like Kyle's talked about, he's produced some new content that we've published this week. And as we're looking ahead to next week, which will mark 10 years since Kyron disappeared, Kyle interviewed Kyron's mother and father. He also interviewed the author of a new book about Kyron's disappearance that he just spoke about. And you can find links to all of that content in the digital Q&A article, as well as right there on KGW.com. And like I said, the KGW News app has a Kyron Horman section dedicated to it. We have a Kyron Horman webpage at KGW.com/Kyron, where you will find all of our Kyron Horman content. We also have a playlist on KGW's YouTube channel that has all the new content that has been produced this week, as well as some of the coverage of the case over the past 10 years. So we really do have a lot of content about Kyron Horman. It's a case that we've always been very interested in, as has this community. And like I said before, we just hope for the best possible resolution, whatever it might be. And I'll go back to Galen and Kyle.
All right, Jared, thank you so much. A lot of very useful resources there for people interested in this case. Let's get to another viewer question here. Someone asks, could this be a trafficking case? What are the chances of this?
I think all options are on the table. I think one of the challenges for me in that theory is that would involve a number of people, right? So it wouldn't just be one person. And so my hope would be if other people are involved, there would be law enforcement would identify that communication or other people who are involved, and someone would come forward. It is a possibility. I think law enforcement has said all along, listen, everything's on the table. But the idea that some network is involved and a number of people are involved to this day and information is not surfaced seems a bit unlikely to me. But again, we don't know. We don't know. And that really is the challenge here. And has really been the challenge, I think. There are a lot of people who ask me the question, why hasn't this case been prosecuted? Why hasn't this been taken to court? In fact, somebody just emailed me this morning and asked that very question. And I think the thing that we need to realize as well is, in prosecuting a case like this, you've got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think there's still a question of what happened to Kyron Horman. And could you prove that beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what happened to him? And I think that would be a challenge for most prosecutors. Not impossible, but certainly a great challenge. Additionally, you talk to legal experts and you have one swing at it. You've got one try. And so if you were to prosecute a case like this, take it to court, and at a later date, new information comes to light, which may be helpful or hinder the investigation, you can't go back and try it again. So those are a couple things to keep in mind when people ask me, hey, why don't they prosecute this case?
It's a really valuable insight there. We've got another viewer question that I think you can clarify. You did mention earlier on in our webcast here that during that initial search, there was nearly no evidence, if any, found. This person wants to know, did they just say that Kyron's backpack was left at school, or where was the backpack?
You know, it's a great question, and I'd have to go back to my notes. This is one of the challenges in having covered something for 10 years. Well, I feel like I have deep knowledge. There's always some little tidbit that I'd hate to be wrong on. As I recall, he'd left his backpack there at school. It was recovered and then returned to the family. I say that somewhat hesitantly, though. I'm not entirely sure, so I'd have to go back and check.
Understood. Very good to clarify that. Well, thank you very much. So, looking at the bigger picture here, why do you think so many people have been drawn to this case? It has generated a lot of questions and comments just during our webcast, let alone over the last 10 years. You are still receiving messages about this.
Oh, it truly is incredible the number of people who are dedicated to this case, and the reach of this case. So, to answer your question, a couple of things. First of all, the immediate response from our community, people felt a close attachment to this little boy and wanted the case resolved. But from there, it just rippled out, and people around the world, and I can truly say around the world, have been attracted to this case and been interested in this case. And I think part of it as well is just the intrigue and the unusual twists and turns this case has taken, not only specific to Kyron's disappearance, but the behaviors of Terry Horman, the stepmother, in the months and really the years afterward. Additionally, there are online communities that have embraced this and taken it on as a challenge to try and uncover new developments, to try and figure out what may have happened, to try and figure out if there are other people who may be involved. And they've embraced this and taken it on as a true crime challenge, if you will. And so they share information and talk about it to this day. I'm always amazed when we do a story at the response that we do see from people who are drawn to it and want to engage, want to ask questions like we've got now. Some of them very specific. I mean, there are probably people online who are at this point as knowledgeable about this case as I am, just based on the research they've done. They've spent hours looking into this. And again, they're not people necessarily in our community, but they're people around the world who ultimately want to see the case solved and want to try and get some answers.
We've talked about this already, but a lot of people are asking about it in the comments right now. So just to circle back to it, they're asking, why hasn't Terry Horman been arrested? And if law enforcement can interview her again.
Yeah. So a couple of things in regards to that. She's had a criminal defense lawyer from early on in this case. And essentially that creates a fence for law enforcement because they can no longer directly access a defendant or a subject or a target of an investigation in it because she has a lawyer. And so any communication that would ultimately go to her would need to go through her lawyer. And so they've made that effort to go through the lawyer and haven't gotten anywhere. And so that kind of is a dead end for law enforcement. As far as arresting Terry Horman, it is worth noting that in the past few years, since she's moved to California, there have been some legal challenges. She's faced some charges. Ultimately, though, she was found not guilty of those charges. They involved a gun and a former roommate. And again, that went through the judicial system and nothing was found. And so that's not on her criminal record. But as far as law enforcement here, certainly, they spent a tremendous amount of time and effort in looking into her past and continue to monitor her activities. But there have been no arrests in this case.
In the video that we played earlier, Kyron's parents mentioned the lie detector test that she didn't pass, Terry Horman. One of our viewers asks, what did Terry's lie detector show? Do we know that?
It was inconclusive, according to the reports that we've seen, and as she suggested on the Dr. Phil show. Now, when Dr. Phil asked her specifically about the lie detector test, she said that there were a couple of reasons. One is that she claimed that she had a hearing problem and was not able to hear the questions clearly, and so that may have been part of the reason. Again, important to note as well, so lie detectors are not admissible in court. So while this is an interesting detail, ultimately, if this were ever to go to court, it's not something that would be entered into the record.
Now, looking at the big picture, this was obviously a monumental case in Oregon. How did this case change policy specifically at Portland Public Schools?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the day he went missing and the fact that the parents didn't realize he was missing until the end of the school day. Since then, the policies at Portland Public have changed. So when your student now doesn't show up for class, say first period, within a short period of time, you actually get a call from the school district saying, hey, your kid wasn't in class. That early notification may have been beneficial in this case because there was a window of about 6 hours where he was missing and they weren't searching. And when it comes to missing children, that's a big window. And so Portland Public changed its policy to notify parents much earlier when a student isn't in class. Additionally, not only because of the Kyron Horman case, but because of the world we live in, unfortunately, there were some security changes at Portland Public as well. Cameras are more common in schools to show video of what's happening in some of the exterior doors and the surroundings. Additionally, some of the entrances are now locked. That is just a primary entrance that is open for the public to use and for invited guests. So those were some of the changes. Again, this really sent a shockwave through that school. So Skyline School, it is a close, tight-knit community of people who live in that surrounding area. And so they were deeply affected, and ultimately it did change the way schools operate in Portland.
Before we wrap up here, we do see that a lot of people are commenting, asking us to post the picture again of Kyron 10 years later, what he may look like. We'll get that posted here in a moment. But before we do that, this is a big question here, and it's one that kind of has been answered, but love to hear it directly from you. Do you feel this case can ever be solved?
Boy, I hope so. I didn't think we'd be here 10 years later talking about this. And I asked Kane and Desiree the same question. And they said, yeah, I did never think we'd be here 10 years later. It's surprising. I would have hoped that at this point we'd have some resolution, but we haven't. The challenge is the passage of time in many ways, not only in finding and obtaining evidence, but secondarily, interest in the case. So, some of the lead detectives, investigators, prosecutors have moved on. They're no longer part of the case. And with that goes some institutional knowledge. And while others can read up on it and be up to speed, they may not know, oh, I remember that one time somebody mentioned something and put two and two together. And so I think that is a real disadvantage for investigators. Ultimately, though, it's going to take one person coming forward or someone with information about this case coming forward, I think. The idea of someone finding something that may be valuable, that's a possibility, sure. But again, it's been 10 years and things change in 10 years. But as far as memories go and people with information, people may still be holding on to information, and it's going to be critical for them to come forward to help solve this case. One other thing I should mention as well as time passes. So while we do have photos of Kyron, including that initial photo of him in front of his science fair project, which we've come to recognize as the face of Kyron Horman, and law enforcement has released age progression photos. Keep in mind, he's much older now. He'd be approaching his 18th birthday. So even the age progression photos that we have of him, he's probably looking a lot different. He's much more mature than that. So keep that in the back of your mind. While it's incredibly important to share that photo and to remember his story, ultimately, the little boy we were once looking for, now more like a man.
Before we wrap up here, is there anything else looking ahead to the 10-year mark next week that you hope people can take away from, and maybe some of the coverage that we've got in store in the next few days?
Yeah, I think while this case is really interesting and there are some fascinating details and a lot of suspicion, at the end of the day, this case is about a missing boy. And I think, and I hope people remember Kyron Horman, because that is really the focus of this story. And that's the hardest part, I think, for a lot of parents, is knowing there's a little boy who's never been found and respecting the fact that there's a family who's missing a little boy. Again, I think we oftentimes do get caught up in the mystery surrounding this case. And, while some of it is somewhat salacious and there's tremendous drama surrounding it, ultimately, this story is about Kyron.
I think on that note, we're going to wrap this up. Kyle Iboshi, thank you so much for your time and expertise answering all these questions. 10 years since Kyron Horman disappeared. That anniversary is next week, and we've got a ton of resources and background on this story on KGW.com. You can find it there right now. We've got our own dedicated page to it there. You can see it, KGW.com/Kyron. From the KGW team, thank you so much for watching this special edition of KGW Digital Q&A. I'm Galen Ettlin. Have a great day.